Ladies and gentlemen, in this video we're going to be talking about one of the important tools that esports drivers use to get quicker in the F1 22 game that a lot of people haven't heard about. This tool has been recently updated, improving its utilization a lot to the casual player. Before, even I wasn't able to properly utilize it as I was unable to compare myself to other people straight up on the time trial leaderboard. But now I believe with recent updates they have now enabled us to compare ourselves to any driver that we select on the time trial leaderboard, which allows us to have a whole heap more data to play with and learn to drive faster. As you may have already guessed, I am talking about RaceNet. It is incredibly easy to access. All you need to do is log in using your preferred account such as Steam, Xbox, or PlayStation, and it pretty much links all your data from all your time trial sessions, or at least the fastest time from your time trial leaderboard. And then it provides you the ability to analyze that lap time compared to someone else's best lap time on the time trial leaderboard. Recently we've had the Singapore Grand Prix and I've had a league race in Singapore as well, so I'm going to be comparing myself to another driver from my league who is well and truly high on the leaderboard, and I figure out where I'm going slower and how I can improve to become just as quick as him, or at least get quicker than where I was before. So once you have logged into racenet.com and selected the track that you would like to analyze, you are then able to see a whole bunch of information such as your brake pressures, your steering angles, your throttle input, and also some important basic information such as your racing line and the gears used in the corners and the speed taken through the corners, which is very useful for analyzing where you can make up some time. You're also able to change the camera view of your car, simulating your lap time. Fortunately, there's not much track references, so you can't really tell that it's Singapore apart from the track map. But that's not overall too important, as the data alone is much more useful in my opinion to obviously find out where you're missing out on the lap time. So it's all well and good seeing your own data, but if you actually want to make some comparisons, you're going to select the time from the leaderboard, and that's where it becomes extremely useful to seeing where you can improve in comparison to another driver. So you're better off selecting someone high up on the leaderboard. In this case, I'm using somebody from my own league, so that way I know it's definitely achievable because I race against him each week. And that also kind of verifies that they're not a hacker. I don't advise trying to achieve the same speeds in the corners as some hackers, so try to find someone that is reputable when you're trying to copy them. Now, it's all well and good seeing the data, but let's actually dive into how to use this information to improve myself next time I jump on the game. Looking at the graphs, you can see your overall speed, the amount of brakes used, throttle input, and also the steering input. If you're a more casual player or get to spend less time on the game than some other players out there, I recommend looking at the steering inputs to start with, because visibly this is going to make probably the most amount of difference, and it's the easiest amount of time to be gained, especially when we're talking about racing lines. If you take the appropriate racing line, you're going to be steering less and you're going to achieve a better lap time just from that alone, regardless of what throttle inputs or brake inputs you're going to be putting into the car. So if you're just starting out to learn a track, or you want to become slightly more competitive at a track and you want to learn the optimal racing line, I recommend going and checking out one of Jarno Opmeer's or an esports driver's lap, such as Frederick Rasmussen, Lucas Blakely, any of those guys, and see what kind of curbs they attack, where they can extend as much as possible on corner entry and exit. And that is the easiest amount of time to be gained at any track, and it's the first thing that should be looked at before diving deeper. It's one of the easier things to pick up because it's very visible what you're doing differently or incorrectly in comparison to someone that is faster than you. Where it gets more difficult is assessing the braking and throttle inputs that a faster driver may be using, even if you're taking the exact same racing line, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. So let's just kick off and assess our own lap here and find out exactly what we are doing wrong in comparison to Leo. Already we're losing time into turn 1. This could be due to lower downforce from Leo, or most likely he got a better exit coming out of the final corner. As you can see here already, our racing line is in fact slightly different, so that's something I can correct straight away by hitting the apex more and taking more curb into turn 1 and turn 2. So that was pretty easy to diagnose, but that will only take you so far. So let's find out what exactly he's doing differently. In the top left corner, you can see he's using 7th gear instead of 8th gear, which means he is relying more on engine braking entering the corner, and he's able to get the car stopped faster with a bit more stability. Once you've synchronized the cars at the corner, you can look at the graphs to see exactly what the driver is doing differently to you. And as you can see, Leo uses less brakes, which is probably because of his line that he's taking into turn 1, and he also gets on throttle way more before entering the second braking zone, which is turn 3. So visually, as you can see, I need to hit the apex more of turn 1 and get on throttle earlier before entering turn 3. Best way to compare this live is to look on the left hand side at the input comparison. Leo also never drops below 5th gear, which is going to allow him to carry more speed and not let the gears and the high revs restrict him from carrying more speed, and also prevents him from needing to short shift exiting the corner and getting him better drive on the exit. Okay, so what we've learned from the first 3 corners is I need to adjust my line slightly, I need to use less brakes into turn 1, use higher gears, and get on throttle a bit more before I enter turn 3. It's also important to note if you're using a different setup to another driver, you're going to have discrepancies from that alone. Next, I'm going to move on to the heavy braking zone after the straight because there's a lot of time to be made or lost in the heavy braking zones. After synchronizing the cars just before the corner, this is where things get a bit interesting and things aren't as obvious if you're looking at things visually instead of looking at the graphs. Now, a recurring theme from Time Trial Ghost is I always see Time Trial Ghost get a better exit than me through the corners, but this all starts with the braking zone. Leo actually gets on the brakes slightly earlier than me, but he spends more time on 100% brake input, whereas I hit 100% and ease off immediately after in the fear that I'm going to lock up. Here, pretty much, I have the exact same racing line and have the same kind of steering input, so I am losing all that time pretty much from the brakes and not getting on the brakes slightly early enough and not using the brakes enough in general to get the car stopped and turned. Once Leo is able to stop the car and turn it, he's able to get on throttle way better than me, and he uses 4th gear instead of 5th gear to get more rotation and uses 7th gear entering the corner instead of 8th gear to get better engine braking. Now, instead of doing a breakdown analysis on every corner, I wanted to get an overarching theme as to why I'm losing time so I can rectify it as quick as possible. And when I zoom out, you can clearly see that Leo is using 100% of the brake way more often than I am, and I'm trailing off way earlier. So it means that I need to use the brakes a lot more and hold on to 100% brake pressure for a longer duration of time before I trail off and then pick up the throttle. This is largely a confidence thing related to the brakes and trying not to lock up and pick the correct brake marker. So in practice, I should be focusing on getting the car stopped more by using 100% brake pressure. On average, I'm using 2 lower gears in the corners and I should be letting the car flow without restricting it to the rev range of lower gears. You could also say that I rely too much on engine braking as I'm using lower gears and not enough brake pressure. So if I was less reliant on engine braking, I'd use the brakes more and I'd be using higher gears. So to visually see this, I'm going to let it play in slow-mo for a little bit, and as you can see, Leo is 100% faster on the exit and my racing line isn't too far off. That means I shouldn't be really focusing so much on changing my racing line, but focusing more on getting the car stopped in the braking zones and getting on the power earlier. Make sure when you're making your comparison at a specific corner that you synchronize the cars just before they enter the corner when looking at the graphs, and you can also jump to each sector to begin the comparison there as well. So now when I go back to the track, I'm going to start braking heavier into the braking zones. I'm going to be using 100% brake more often. Make the slight changes to the racing line that I need to, especially in sector 1. Use high gears when hitting the apexes of corners and entering the corners. And as a result of getting the car stopped earlier and turned earlier, you're able to get on power earlier. And that's what's going to give you the momentum down the straights and give you a whole bunch more speed. And you can even see on the graph in some areas, I'm too lazy to get on throttle. I should be getting on throttle as much as I can in between the corners in particular, whereas I'm a lot more linear than Leo. I should be hitting those limits of traction way sooner as much as I can. Now the brakes is an interesting thing because it can also be the difference in the type of pedal that you use or whether you're on controller. Obviously there's a large difference between a potentiometer brake and a load cell pedal brake, and if you're losing a lot of your time in the braking zones, it may be worth investing in a load cell pedal to become more accurate because it's based on pressure rather than how far the pedal travels. So to break down the learnings of this video, the first thing you should look at is your steering input in the racing line that you take. Compare it to some of the best in the world, such as the esports drivers. Make sure you're following the exact same racing line as them, because if they're the best in the world, then obviously that's going to be a really good racing line to take. After that, you should look at the gears used by the top drivers in the corners and try to mimic exactly what they do. Obviously, different conditions warrants different inputs, but majority of the time you're going to try and want to use what they're using, or maybe potentially short shift instead, depending on your driving style. But using higher gears seems to be the trend, and that's going to allow you to get on power earlier, as well as there will be less wheel spin. Those are the easiest things to fix because you can visually see what you're doing wrong. But then after that, you should look into obviously how much you're braking, how early, how late you should be braking, and as a result of that, how early you can get on throttle. I hope this video gives you a good demonstration on how to actually use the tool instead of just showing you that it exists, because clearly I need to make up some time at Singapore. I'm like almost a second slower than Leo here. This is something definitely esports drivers would be looking into to find anything that they're doing is suboptimal. That's how they're perfect all the time. They're basically perfectionists, and this is the easiest way to find something that you're doing suboptimally and correct it. To wrap it up, if you're a beginner, mostly focus on steering inputs, the racing line, and what gears to use. After that, if you're intermediate or trying to get even faster, then focus on brake inputs and also the throttle inputs as well, which is a little bit harder to determine what you're doing incorrectly or where you can find the time. If you enjoyed this video or you found it helpful at all, please do leave a like and subscribe. It helps the channel out a whole bunch, and I'll see you all in a brand new one.